The wind that night carried a sound I hadn't heard in years. Not the low moan of the old pine trees behind my house, not the brittle crack of ice breaking on the eaves, but something sharper, closer. 3 deliberate knocks on my front door. I glanced at the clock. 9:47 p.m. Nobody in this town visits unannounced at that hour, especially not in the middle of a snowstorm. The house had been quiet all evening. I'd kept the radio low, the kettle on the stove hissing softly. Outside, the world was swallowed by white. Snow drifting sideways in sheets under the porch light, the road already invisible beneath it. Another knock, this one louder. I hesitated at the window by the door, pulling the curtain back just enough to see. There he was, a young man, tall, dark hair plastered to his forehead, jacket crusted with snow. One gloved hand still resting on the doorframe as if he wasn't sure I'd open it. I'd never seen him before. When I cracked the door, the cold rushed in like a living thing. "Ma'am," he said, breath steaming in the air. "I'm sorry to bother you, but my truck's stuck down the hill. I don't have anywhere else to go." His voice carried that edge of exhaustion people get when they've been fighting the cold too long. I should have told him the nearest motel was 15 minutes away. I should have told him to try the Johnson's farm, but something about the way he looked at me, like I was his last chance, made my words catch. "Come in," I heard myself say. He stepped inside, stamping snow from his boots, eyes darting around the room like he was memorizing it. "You're not from around here," I said. "No, ma'am, just passing through." I poured him a mug of tea, watching his hands thaw around the ceramic. The storm outside howled louder, and in that moment I knew he wouldn't be leaving tonight. What I didn't know, what I couldn't have guessed, was that this stranger's arrival was about to tear open a part of my past I'd kept buried for 23 years. He sat by the fire like he'd been there before, hands outstretched toward the heat, steam curling from his sleeves as the snow melted. His eyes, though, they didn't wander to the flames. They kept drifting toward the mantel, to the framed photograph I hadn't touched in years. It was of my husband, Daniel, taken the summer before the accident. He was smiling the way he only ever smiled when he thought no one was looking. "You live here alone?" the young man asked. His voice was low, careful. It didn't sound like a question meant for small talk. "I do," I said. The words felt heavier than usual. I'd never liked admitting it out loud. He nodded, gaze flicking back to the photograph. "You lose him. Long ago." I stiffened. Most strangers don't ask that. 23 years, I said finally. The wind outside rattled the window like bones in a jar. "I'm sorry," he murmured, but there was something in his tone, something not quite like pity, almost familiarity. He didn't tell me his name until I asked. "Eli," he said. "Just Eli. No last name offered." "Eli," I repeated, letting the sound sit between us. It was a name I'd heard before, though I couldn't place when. The fire popped, sending sparks up the chimney. I got up to refill his tea, and when I came back, he was studying the old leather-bound journal on the side table. "My journal? That's private," I said. He didn't touch it, just leaned back with that unreadable look that made my stomach knot. The storm howled louder. The lights flickered once, and I knew we were about to lose power. And in the brief darkness between flickers, I saw it. A small silver chain around his neck, the same kind of chain Daniel used to wear. The power went out just as the wind screamed against the siding, leaving the room lit only by the glow of the fire. I watched that silver chain catch the light for half a second before Eli tucked it back under his shirt. It wasn't just any chain. I knew the clasp, the worn edges of the links, the way the silver had dulled with age. Daniel had worn one exactly like it, the kind you didn't buy at a store, the kind you were given. "You cold?" I asked to break the silence. "A little," he said, but he didn't shiver. He looked too steady for someone who'd been stranded in a storm. I fetched a blanket from the linen closet, one my mother had knitted before she passed. When I draped it over his shoulders, he looked up at me, and in that instant, I caught a flicker in his eyes. Recognition. Not the polite recognition of meeting someone new, something deeper, like he already knew me. "How long have you been on the road?" I asked. "A while," he said. "Long enough?" That's not an answer. He almost smiled, but didn't. Instead, he reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small folded map, not a GPS screen, not a phone, an actual paper map, edges frayed. "I'm looking for someone," he said. My chest tightened. "Who?" He hesitated, like saying it out loud might turn the search into something real. "A woman," he said finally. "She used to live in this town, a long time ago." Something in his tone made the fire feel less warm. I forced my voice to stay even. "What's her name?" The storm outside roared, and the logs in the fireplace cracked and fell inward, sending a rush of sparks up the chimney. Eli's gaze didn't leave mine. "Her name was Claire Harper," he said. I hadn't heard that name spoken aloud in over 2 decades. Not since the night everything changed. For a moment I couldn't speak. The name hung in the air between us, as if the wind outside had carried it in and set it on the hearth. No one in this town called me Claire anymore, not since the autumn after Daniel's death, when I'd packed away the photographs and started answering to my middle name, Margaret. A safer name, a name with no history attached. I set my mug down slowly. "You've come a long way," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "But whoever you're looking for, I don't think she's here anymore." Eli didn't blink. "You're her," he said softly. Not a question, a statement. The blanket slipped from his shoulders as he leaned forward. "I've been looking for you for almost 2 years. My pulse quickened. "Why?" He hesitated, and for the first time since stepping inside, he looked uncertain. "I think you knew my father." The fire cracked sharply. The room suddenly felt too small, the walls pressing in with the weight of old memories. I gripped the armrest of my chair. "What was your father's name?" "Thomas," he said. "Thomas Grady." I felt my breath catch. The name hit like ice water down my spine. I hadn't heard it since the night the 3 of us stood on the edge of Harper's Bridge, snow falling in silent sheets, and Daniel's hand was clenched around mine so tightly it hurt. The memory came back in flashes, a shout, a slip, the rush of black water below, and then nothing but the sound of the current swallowing everything. Eli's voice pulled me back. "My father told me to find you before he stopped swallowing hard. Before it was too late." The storm outside eased for just a moment, as if the wind itself was listening. I wanted to ask him too late for what, but something in his eyes told me the answer would change everything. The power didn't come back. The fire was the only light left in the room, its orange glow painting the walls with restless shadows. Eli sat across from me, the blanket bunched in his lap, and for a long while neither of us spoke. The kettle on the stove had gone silent, its warmth fading into the cold air creeping from the corners. I could hear the storm pressing against the house. Not the violent roar from earlier, but a low, steady hum like the sound of a train far off in the dark. Eli's eyes stayed on me. It wasn't the kind of stare meant to intimidate, but the kind that waits, as if the truth might slip out if I just sat in silence long enough. "You said your father told you to find me," I began. "What exactly did he say?" Eli leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "He didn't talk much about the past, but sometimes he'd have these nights where he couldn't sleep. He'd sit at the kitchen table with a glass of whiskey, and he'd talk about a winter in Montana, about a man named Daniel, and a woman named Claire Harper." I felt the name cut through me again. He went on. "He said something happened that winter, something that took a piece of him he never got back. He wouldn't tell me what, just that if I ever wanted to understand who he really was, I had to find you." My fingers curled into the fabric of my sweater. "He's still alive?" I asked. Eli's jaw tightened. Not anymore. The fire cracked, throwing sparks into the air. I stared at him, at the silver chain just visible under his collar. Was that his? I asked, nodding toward it. He shook his head. No. He said it belonged to Daniel. Said you'd know why. The chain seemed heavier in the dim light, and with it came the weight of a memory I'd spent years locking away. The night Daniel slipped it from his neck and pressed it into my hand, his eyes asking me to keep it safe. Only I'd lost it. So how in God's name was it hanging around Eli's neck now? I couldn't take my eyes off it. That dull silver glint, the way it swayed slightly with every breath he took, the same chain I'd last seen on Daniel's neck the night he drowned. Where did you get that? My voice came out sharper than I intended. Eli reached for the chain slowly, as if aware of its gravity between us. My father gave it to me when I was 17. Said it wasn't his to keep, but he wore it for a while because the man it belonged to couldn't anymore. The fire hissed and popped. My throat tightened. Why would Daniel's chain be with your father? Eli's gaze didn't waver. Because he was there, Claire, that night at Harper's Bridge. The name of the bridge was like a ghost in the room. Unwelcome, ice cold, unshakable. I gripped the armrest until my knuckles ached. Your father never told you what happened. Bits and pieces, Eli said. He said it was snowing so hard you couldn't see the water below, said there was shouting, said Daniel slipped, but he never told me who was shouting or why. The memory fought its way to the surface, whether I wanted it to or not. The blinding snow, the way Daniel's voice cracked when he said my name, the silhouette of another man standing just behind him, Thomas, and then the sudden absence of weight beside me, the rush of black water swallowing everything. I forced myself to meet Eli's eyes. What do you think happened? I asked. He didn't blink. I think my father spent the rest of his life trying to make peace with something he couldn't change, and I think you know exactly what that was. The firelight made his face look older in that moment, and for the first time I noticed the resemblance, the line of his jaw, the way he clenched his hands when he was holding back. He looked like Thomas. Outside, the wind picked up again, whistling through the cracks in the old window frames, and in that sound I heard the same hollow roar the river made the night it took Daniel away. I didn't want to tell it, not after all these years, not after building a life on silence, but Eli's eyes held the kind of weight you don't shake off by turning away. So I leaned back, let the firelight blur at the edges, and let the night come back to me. It was late, past midnight, and the snow had been falling for hours, soft at first, then heavier, turning the road to the bridge into a narrow, white tunnel. Daniel had insisted on going out there, said he needed to meet someone, he wouldn't say who. I remember the way his hand felt in mine, warm even in the cold, his steps steady on the icy planks. Then we saw him, a figure at the far end of the bridge, shoulders hunched, hands jammed deep in his coat pockets. Thomas Grady. I didn't know Thomas well, but I knew enough to feel my stomach twist. Daniel had told me once, quietly, that Thomas was a man who didn't forgive easily. When we reached him, the wind picked up hard enough to make the bridge groan under our feet. The three of us stood there, breath turning to white ghosts in the air. I can't remember who spoke first. Maybe it was Thomas, maybe Daniel. But I remember the words were sharp, cutting through the storm like broken glass. Daniel stepped closer to him, and I felt my grip on his hand loosen, just for a moment. That's when it happened. A slip, a shout, and then Daniel was gone. Vanished into the dark, the sound of the river swallowing his name. I dropped to my knees, my hands clutching at the empty air where he'd been. Thomas stood there, his face pale as the snow, his breath ragged, and in his hand, the chain. I never asked him for it. I never asked him what really happened in those final seconds. Maybe I was afraid of the answer. Eli's voice pulled me back to the present. So my father, he didn't push him? I stared at him, the truth sitting on the edge of my tongue. But I wasn't ready. Not yet. The silence after my last words was heavier than the storm outside. Eli leaned back in the armchair, his eyes never leaving my face. The fire crackled between us, but the warmth couldn't cut through the cold settling in my chest. "You didn't answer my question," he said finally. "Did he fall, or was he pushed?" I wrapped my arms around myself. "I told you what I remember." He shook his head slowly. "No, you told me what you're willing to remember." The way he said it made my skin prickle. I had spent 23 years learning how to bury the parts of that night that could shatter me. But Eli had the same stubborn eyes his father did. He wasn't going to let this go. The wind slammed against the side of the house, and for a moment it felt like the whole place might come apart. Snow rattled against the window panes, blurring the outside world into nothing but white. "You know what I don't get?" Eli's voice was calm, too calm. "If my father really was there, if he saw Daniel fall, why would he take the chain? Why would he keep it all those years?" I looked at the fire because I couldn't look at him. "Maybe it was guilt," I said. "Maybe it was something else." He leaned forward. "Or maybe it was because Daniel gave it to him." The words hit like a sudden drop in the temperature. "That's not possible," I said quickly. "Why not?" "Because," I started, then stopped myself. The truth was tangled in memories I'd kept locked away, memories that could unravel everything I'd told myself since that night. Before I could speak again, Eli reached into his pocket and pulled something out. A small, weathered photograph. The edges were curled, the colors faded into a soft wash of brown and gray. He handed it to me. It was Daniel. Younger, smiling, standing with his arm around Thomas, and there, in Daniel's other hand, was the chain. "This was taken a week before he died," Eli said. "My father kept it hidden. I found it after his funeral." The photograph trembled in my hands because I knew exactly where it had been taken, and I also knew I'd been the one holding the camera. Eli didn't take his eyes off me as I stared at the picture. The edges dug into my fingers, but it was the weight of the memory that pressed hardest. "You were there," he said quietly. "You took this, didn't you?" The fire popped, a sharp crack that made me flinch. I set the photograph down on the table, careful not to let it touch the edge of the flames. "Yes," I said finally. My voice felt small in the room. "I took it." Eli leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "Why? Why were they together that day? My father never went into town unless he had to. And from the way they're smiling, it doesn't look like two men who hated each other." I looked at the faces in the picture again. Daniel's smile, open, easy. Thomas's, smaller but genuine. They had been friends once, before everything soured. "They grew up together," I said. "Same school, same baseball team. They were inseparable for a long time." "What happened?" Eli pressed. I hesitated because this part of the story wasn't mine alone, but the truth had been waiting too long in the dark. "It was me," I said, the words almost choking in my throat. "They both loved me, and for a while, I loved them both back." Eli's face tightened, but he didn't interrupt, so I went on. "It wasn't supposed to be like that. I was young. I thought love could be harmless if it stayed in different corners of your life. But corners have a way of touching when you least expect it. I could see the winter afternoon clear as if it were yesterday. The three of us at the frozen lake, Daniel pulling me close for the photograph, Thomas standing just to the side until Daniel reached out and looped an arm around him. A joke was made. The shutter clicked, and for one brief second the tension between them vanished. That was the last day they were ever truly friends, I said. Eli sat back, the firelight sharpening the line of his jaw. "So whatever happened on that bridge was because of you?" I opened my mouth to deny it, but the truth was there in my silence. The fire had burned down to a slow, steady glow, embers pulsing red like a heartbeat. Eli leaned back, but his gaze stayed locked on me, steady, unblinking, as if measuring the weight of every word I'd said. "You're telling me," he began, his voice low and careful, "that the man who raised me and the man you married stopped being friends because of you." The way he said it wasn't loud, but it carried an edge that stung worse than a shout. "I didn't plan for it to happen," I said quietly. "I loved Daniel, but I cared about Thomas too. I didn't know how to choose without breaking something." Eli's mouth twitched. Not quite a smile, more like a grimace that couldn't decide what it wanted to be. "My father never said your name without..." A kind of pause, like he was remembering something that hurt, but he didn't want to let go of it. I dropped my gaze to my hands, because his eyes felt too much like an interrogation light. "That winter," I said slowly, "I thought the past was behind us. I thought Daniel and Thomas had found some sort of peace, but the night at Harper's Bridge proved me wrong." The storm outside rattled the windows again, as if reminding us it was still there, waiting. When I looked back at Eli, something in his expression had shifted. The hardness was still there, but beneath it, there was something else, something softer, something that unsettled me in a different way. "You talk about them like you still see them," he said, "like they're still in this room." I swallowed. "In some ways they are." The words seemed to hang in the firelight between us. He didn't move, but I could feel the change in the air, that faint, dangerous current that comes when the past and present start bleeding into each other. And in that moment, I realized the thing that unsettled me most about Eli wasn't that he looked like his father. It was that sometimes, in the way he watched me, I caught glimpses of Daniel too. The wind howled harder as the night dragged on, a restless animal clawing at the cabin walls. Eli moved to check the window, but the snow was so thick it blurred the world into nothing but white. "Road's gone," he muttered. "Even if we wanted to leave, we couldn't." The words landed heavy in the space between us, like a verdict neither of us wanted to hear. I poured the last of the cocoa into his cup, watching the steam curl upward. "You'll have to stay here tonight," I said, my voice steady, though my pulse wasn't. He took the cup from my hands, and for the briefest moment, his fingers brushed mine. It was nothing, barely a touch, and yet the warmth of it lingered far longer than it should have. We sat by the fire, silent except for the crackle of wood. I could feel the weight of his presence beside me, the way every small movement seemed louder, more deliberate in the stillness. "Tell me something," he said suddenly, his voice breaking the quiet. "If it had been you and my father, would you have stayed?" The question caught me off guard. I turned to face him, but his eyes were fixed on the fire as if afraid of the answer. "I don't know," I admitted. "Some loves don't survive the world we live in, and some aren't meant to." His jaw tightened. "But they can still burn, can't they? Even years later?" I felt the pull in his words, the dangerous slope they hinted at. "Yes," I whispered. "They can." The fire popped, and the sound seemed to draw us closer without either of us meaning to. When I looked at him again, his face was only inches from mine, the shadows of the flames painting his features in gold and amber. For a moment, neither of us moved. The storm outside roared, but inside, the air was thick and still. It wasn't love, it wasn't lust, it was something more complicated, a tether strung between memory and present, pulling us both toward a place we weren't supposed to go. And when I finally leaned back, breaking the moment, I could still feel the phantom heat of him beside me, lingering like the aftertaste of a secret. The fire had been our anchor through the storm, its light, its heat, the steady rhythm of wood cracking as the wind howled outside. But sometime after midnight, while Eli was half asleep in the chair, the flames began to sink lower, too low. I rose quietly, pulling the wool shawl tighter around my shoulders, and stepped toward the woodpile. The logs were heavy, damp from the cold. When I tried to place one onto the embers, my hand slipped. The log tumbled forward, sending a spray of sparks into the air. One ember landed on the old rug, its edge beginning to smolder. "Claire!" Eli's voice was sharp, his chair scraping back. In an instant, he was beside me, grabbing the edge of the rug, yanking it toward the hearth before the flames could spread. The movement was clumsy in the tight space, and in the scramble, we collided, my shoulder against his chest, his arm instinctively wrapping around my waist to steady me. For a moment, time thinned. His breath was warm against my temple, his grip strong but not unkind. "I've got you," he murmured, his voice low, almost an afterthought. When the rug was safe and the ember dead, we didn't step apart immediately. I should have. I told myself I would, but something in the closeness felt dangerously easy. His heartbeat was steady under my palm. Mine wasn't. Finally, I pulled back, my fingers brushing against his sweater as I let go. He searched my face for something, an answer maybe, or a permission I wasn't ready to give. "Guess I'm better at fixing cars than fires," he said with a half smile, trying to shake off the weight of the moment. But I knew, we both knew, that whatever thread had been pulled tonight, it wasn't going back to where it had been. The storm had eased by morning, but the air outside still carried the sharp bite of winter. Eli had already been in the garage for hours, working on an old truck that belonged to the Johnsons down the road. I'd gone over with a thermos of coffee, a neighborly thing, I told myself, and found him bent over the engine, grease on his hands, his hair messy under a wool cap. "You're early," he said, without looking up, accepting the cup with a nod. "You didn't have to bring this." "I wanted to," I replied, and it was true, though I wasn't sure if he heard the sincerity or just the words. For a while, we didn't talk, only the click of metal tools, the occasional grunt of effort. Then, without warning, he set the wrench down and leaned against the workbench, eyes fixed on a point that wasn't the truck or me. "My dad used to stand here," he said quietly. "Same spot, same tools, but he wasn't fixing engines. He was just avoiding the house." I stayed still, my hands wrapped around the thermos, letting the silence invite him to go on. He wasn't violent, not in the way people mean, but he knew how to cut deep without touching you. He'd look at me like I was already a disappointment, like my life had been written out and it wasn't worth the ink. His voice caught on the last word and he rubbed the back of his neck as if embarrassed. "I left before I turned 18, he continued. "Didn't even finish school, worked whatever jobs I could find, thought if I kept moving I'd never have to hear that voice again." I wanted to say something, anything, to bridge the space between his story and my own loneliness, but the truth was, I understood him more than I wanted to admit. I knew the kind of wounds that didn't show, the ones that lived under the skin, tender to the touch years later. "You didn't deserve that," I said finally. The words felt too small, but they were all I had. He looked at me then, really looked, and for a second, it felt like we were standing on the same side of something invisible. That evening, I sat at the kitchen table with the radio low, the soft hum of a blues guitar filling the empty spaces. Outside, the snow had settled into a pale, unbroken sheet, and the world felt quieter than it should have. Eli had stopped by on his way home, returning a scarf I'd lent him last week. He placed it on the counter, but he didn't leave. Instead, he lingered, his eyes scanning the framed photographs along the wall. Snapshots from years when my smile had been a little less practiced. "You look different here," he said, pointing to one picture. Me and my ex-husband on a summer porch, our hands loosely linked. It was a moment staged for the camera, but frozen in a way that made it seem real. I admitted, and then without really deciding to, I told him the story. We'd married young, not foolishly, but with the kind of certainty that makes you blind to the shadows. He was charming in public, steady in the ways people value. But at home, there was this constant erosion, small criticisms that felt like water dripping on stone. Harmless at first, but over years they carved hollows in me. I told Eli about the dinners eaten in silence, about the nights I'd lay awake listening to the house creak, wondering if it was me or him holding all the cold between us. I told him about the day I found a receipt for flowers I never received. That was when the certainty cracked. I stayed another 5 years after that, I said quietly. Not because I wanted to, but because I couldn't imagine being someone without him. Turns out, you can forget who you are without even noticing. Eli didn't say I should have left sooner. He didn't tell me I was strong for leaving. He just pulled out a chair and sat across from me, his hands resting on the table, his gaze steady. "Guess we both know what it's like," he murmured. "To live in a place where someone's voice feels louder than your own." Something inside me shifted then, not healed, but loosened, like a knot finally ready to be untied. The storm came in without warning. One moment, the world outside my kitchen window was a calm wash of gray, and the next, it was swallowed by a swirling wall of white. The wind howled against the siding, rattling the gutters like loose change. Eli had been on his way out when it hit. He opened the door, only to be met with a blast of snow that shoved him back inside. "Yeah, not happening," he said, stamping his boots. "You'd be lucky to see 3 feet ahead in that mess." The forecast had mentioned flurries, nothing more, but Montana storms have a way of rewriting the script in real time. I fetched a blanket from the couch and tossed it to him. "You'll have to wait it out here," I said. It wasn't the first time I'd had someone stuck in my house during bad weather, but it felt different, like the walls knew something I didn't. We moved to the living room, the fire humming in the hearth. Eli sat on the floor, back against the couch, close enough that I could see the flecks of snow melting in his hair. Hours passed in a strange rhythm. We talked about the storm, then about music, then about the time he'd tried to fix his uncle's old pickup and nearly set the garage on fire. We laughed, really laughed, the kind that makes you forget the clock. But somewhere between stories, the conversation slipped into quieter waters. "Doesn't bother you?" he asked suddenly. "Having me here like this?" I shook my head. "If it did, you'd be out there in the snow by now." His mouth twitched into something between a smirk and a sigh. "You know, you don't feel like most people, like you actually hear things when someone talks instead of just waiting to answer." I didn't know what to say to that, so I just reached for the teapot, pouring us both another cup. Outside, the storm roared, but in here, the air felt warmer than it should have. And though neither of us said it, I think we both knew. This wasn't just weather keeping him here. By late afternoon, the storm had settled into a steady, relentless curtain of snow. Outside, the pine trees were hunched under the weight, their branches bowing like old men in prayer. Inside, the fire had burned low, and the living room was bathed in that deep, golden light that makes every shadow softer than it should be. Eli had pulled his chair closer to the hearth. His boots were off now, thick wool socks propped toward the heat. I could smell the faint tang of the outdoors still clinging to him. Snow, pine, something faintly metallic like cold air on a winter morning. "Your place is quiet," he murmured, eyes on the flames. "Not just the noise kind of quiet, the other kind, the kind that makes your head slow down." I sat across from him, knitting in my lap, though I'd stopped a while ago. His words felt heavier than casual conversation, like a confession he wasn't sure he meant to give. At some point, the kettle began to whistle. I went to the kitchen, grateful for the excuse to breathe, but when I came back with 2 mugs, he was on the couch instead, one leg tucked under him, watching the snow through the wide front window. I set the tea down on the table, and as I leaned forward, my hand brushed his, just barely. A quick, accidental contact, but it was enough. We both froze for a fraction of a second, and in that pause, I felt everything I'd been trying not to notice. how close we were sitting now, how his gaze lingered just a moment too long, how the air felt thick with something unsaid. He cleared his throat first. "Thanks," he said, wrapping both hands around the mug. But the word carried more than gratitude. It carried an awareness. The fire crackled, the storm whispered against the glass, and somewhere deep inside me, a door I'd kept locked for years shifted on its hinges. It happened so suddenly that, for a moment, I thought the storm had simply grown louder. But then, the room dimmed, the hum of the old refrigerator faded, and the firelight became the only pulse of color in the house. "The power's out," Eli said quietly, glancing toward the darkened kitchen. It wasn't unusual here in winter, but it always carried that uneasy edge, the reminder that you were at the mercy of the weather, that the modern world could blink away without warning. I went to the cupboard, pulling down the drawer of candles. Matches, too, always in the same tin box. Eli joined me without asking, his tall frame moving easily through the shadowed room. As we lit the first few candles, the living room shifted into something else entirely. The walls closer, the corners softer, the world outside erased, except for the muted hiss of snow against glass. "I'll check the breaker just in case," he said, slipping on his boots and coat. Minutes later, he was back, hair dusted white, cheeks flushed from the cold. "No luck. It's the whole street." We both knew what that meant. No heat but the fire, no lights but the ones we just lit, and hours, maybe all night, before it came back. "Here," I said, pulling a quilt from the hall closet. We sat on the couch, sharing the thick weight of it. Our shoulders touched, just enough to be noticed. The silence between us wasn't empty anymore. It was layered, with the steady crackle of the fire, with the faint scent of wood smoke on our clothes, with the awareness of how close his knee was to mine. "You're not the kind of neighbor I expected when I moved here," he said suddenly, his voice low, almost thoughtful. I turned my head. In a good way or a bad way? His mouth curved, just barely. "In a way I'm still figuring out." The fire popped, and I felt that same door inside me shift again, its hinges loosening under the weight of his presence. The storm had settled into a slow, relentless rhythm, snow piling against the window panes like white sand. The only light came from the fireplace and a single candle on the coffee table, its flame bowing and swaying each time the wind pressed against the house. Eli leaned back, one arm draped over the couch behind me. The quilt covered both our legs, but the heat between us wasn't entirely from the fabric. "You know," he said after a long pause, "you've never told me why you came back here." I hesitated, my fingers curling into the edge of the quilt. "I suppose I didn't think it mattered. It matters to me." His tone wasn't demanding, but it had a weight to it, the kind that made you want to answer. So I told him. About the years I'd spent away, the marriage that had drained me quietly, the way my mother's passing had pulled me back to this town like a tide. "And you?" I asked, my voice softer now. "Why did you come here? You could have gone anywhere." He was quiet for a long time, his gaze fixed on the candle flame as though it held the answer for him. Finally he said, "I needed somewhere no one knew me, somewhere I could breathe." There was something in the way he said it, not just about leaving a place, but escaping a version of himself. Before I could ask more, the wind slammed hard against the house, and the candle flickered so wildly I thought it might go out. Without thinking, Eli reached across me to steady it, his hand brushing mine. That brief contact felt dangerous, not because it was wrong, but because of how right it felt. We sat there, the space between us now a thread pulled tight. Neither of us moved to break it. The power finally gave out. One second the candlelight trembled against the walls, the next, darkness swallowed the room whole. Outside, the wind howled as if it had been waiting for its cue. The silence inside was thick, broken only by the occasional snap from the fireplace. "I'll get the lantern," I said. But when I tried to stand, Eli's hand found my arm. "Wait, you'll trip over something. Just stay here for a minute." His touch was gentle but steady, anchoring me in place. The quilt had slipped, and I felt the sudden coolness on my shoulder right before he pulled it back up, his fingers grazing my skin. My breath caught. "It's fine," I murmured, though I wasn't sure what I meant. Fine that the lights were out. Fine that his hand lingered a second too long. Fine that my heart was doing its best to leap out of my chest. He sat closer, and in the dim orange glow of the fire, I could see the faint outline of his jaw, the steady rise and fall of his chest. We weren't touching, not quite, but the space between us was so small it could have been erased with the shift of a breath. Then a loud crash sounded outside, something toppling in the wind. I flinched, and without thinking, my hand found his. Warm, solid. He didn't pull away. The moment stretched, slow and fragile, until the sound outside faded. Neither of us said a word, and in the quiet that followed, it felt like we had already crossed a line, even if nothing had happened yet. The wind outside had eased, but inside, the air felt charged, like the pause before a summer storm. Eli's hand was still in mine. Neither of us looked down at it, as if acknowledging it would make it real. "I should probably check the generator," he said quietly, but he didn't move. His voice was low, almost careful, like he was afraid the wrong word might break something we didn't want broken. I should have let him go. I should have laughed it off, made a joke about how the storm could take its sweet time. Instead, I shifted closer. The quilt fell over both our shoulders now, and the warmth of his body was immediate. It was the kind of warmth that made you forget winter even existed. He turned his head toward me, and even in the dim light, I could see the question in his eyes. Not a demand, not even a request, just a quiet, patient wondering. I didn't answer with words. My hand moved, almost of its own accord, brushing a strand of hair away from his forehead. His eyes closed at the touch, briefly, like he was memorizing it, and then, just once, just for a heartbeat, his lips found my temple. It wasn't a kiss, not really, but it was enough. Enough to change the air between us, enough to tell us both that whatever we'd been pretending to ignore wasn't going away. We stayed like that for a long time, listening to the fire crackle, neither of us mentioning what had just happened, but I knew, and he knew, there was no undoing it now. That night, sleep didn't come easily. I lay on the couch, quilt pulled to my chin, watching the shadows shift along the walls. The fire had burned low, and every so often, the wood let out a soft sigh. Eli was in the chair across from me, his head tilted back, breathing slow and even. He'd insisted on keeping watch, said he'd stay up in case the storm worsened. I told myself it was safer this way. 2 people awake would be overkill. 1 would be enough. I told myself he was just being decent, that this was all about the weather, about practicality, about nothing else. But the truth sat heavy in my chest because I'd felt it. The way he hesitated before letting go of my hand earlier. The way his eyes had softened when I brushed his hair aside. The way his lips had lingered on my temple just a moment too long. And I knew this wasn't just the storm keeping us inside. It was something else. Something that had been building quietly, thread by thread. Each time we spoke, each time we didn't, I tried to turn away from it, to think about work, about home, about the life I was supposed to be living, but every road my mind took led back to this cabin, to the steady sound of Eli breathing in the chair, to the memory of his hand wrapped around mine. So I started building excuses. We were just 2 people stuck in bad weather. It didn't mean anything. It couldn't. I repeated the lie until my chest stopped aching. Or maybe I just got used to the ache. I woke to the smell of coffee. Not the bitter, burnt kind I usually made for myself, but something richer, fuller, like it had been coaxed into life, rather than rushed. Eli stood by the stove, one hand wrapped around a chipped mug, the other holding a wooden spoon over a small pan. The scent of frying eggs drifted through the cabin. "Morning," he said without turning, as if he'd been waiting for me to say it first. "Morning," I replied, my voice still rough from sleep. It should have felt awkward. After all, we'd spent the night pretending not to hear the other shift or breathe, but he smiled when he finally looked over, and the lines around his eyes crinkled, softening the weight that always seemed to hang on him. I sat at the table, hands wrapped around the mug he slid my way. The warmth seeped into my fingers, and I pretended not to notice how his hand brushed mine for just a fraction of a second. We didn't talk about the storm. We didn't talk about the night before. Instead, we talked about the road into town, whether the plows would have made it this far, whether the gas station would be open. It was nothing talk. Safe talk. The kind of talk people use when they're both standing on the edge of something but refuse to look down. And yet, every glance felt like a question. Every silence felt like an answer neither of us dared to speak aloud. When he handed me my plate, I thanked him, but my voice caught halfway through. He noticed. Of course he noticed, but he didn't say anything. We were two actors in a play no one had written, performing lines that didn't exist, pretending we didn't know the next scene was already inevitable. By mid-morning, the storm had eased. The air outside was so still it almost felt wrong, like the world was holding its breath. Snow lay heavy on the roof, and icicles clung to the eaves like crystal knives. Eli pulled on his jacket. "I'll check the road," he said. His voice was casual, but there was something in the way he zipped his coat, tight, deliberate, that told me he wasn't just checking the road. I followed him out anyway. The cold hit like a clean blade, sharp and pure. The snow crunched under our boots, each step leaving a perfect imprint. We made our way down the path that led toward the main road, passing the shed where he kept the tools. Halfway there, he stopped. I nearly bumped into him. "What is it?" I asked. He didn't answer at first, just stared down at the ground. There, in the untouched blanket of snow, were tracks. Not ours. These were older, edges softened but still visible. Boot prints, heading toward the cabin, and then away again. A prickle ran up my spine. "When did—" I started, but he cut me off. "Last night," he said, voice low. "Had to be. The wind would have buried them sooner otherwise." We stood there in silence, the world suddenly too quiet, as if even the trees were listening. Somewhere deep inside, I felt the fragile morning we'd just shared splinter apart. Whatever was out here with us wasn't part of our play acting, and it wasn't leaving. We hurried back to the cabin, the sound of our boots in the snow louder than I remembered. Inside, Eli dropped his jacket on the hook, but didn't take off his gloves. I closed the door and leaned against it, as if keeping the cold and whatever left those tracks outside was just a matter of holding it shut. "You knew," I said. "It wasn't a question." His eyes flicked toward mine, then away. "I saw them this morning," he admitted. "Didn't want to wake you until I was sure." "Sure of what? That someone had been here? Or that they'd come back?" "Eli." My voice caught on his name. "Who could it be? We're miles from anyone." He hesitated, as if choosing between two bad answers. Then he said, "There's a man. Lives off-grid. Further north. Not right in the head. Keeps to himself. Mostly." The word felt heavy in the air. "What does he want?" Eli rubbed the back of his neck. "Don't know, but I've caught him watching before. Once he left something on the porch, a dead fox." The room seemed smaller now. The cabin walls, once comforting, felt like they were keeping us in as much as they were keeping the cold out. I crossed my arms, trying to hold in the tremor running through me. "And you didn't tell me?" "I didn't want you scared," he said, but the look in his eyes told me he was scared enough for both of us. Outside, somewhere in the white silence, a branch cracked. The wind had been building all afternoon, but by nightfall it became a living thing, a roar that pressed its weight against the cabin. I was washing the mugs when it happened, a flicker, then black. The hum of the old fridge died, and the heater went silent. Eli? My voice sounded too loud in the sudden stillness. Stay here? His boots thudded across the wooden floor as he grabbed the flashlight. The narrow beam sliced through the dark, catching dust motes and the pale steam of our breath. The storm outside clawed at the windows, but beneath it, so faint I thought I imagined it, came another sound. Crunch, pause, crunch. I froze. Eli, someone's outside. He swung the flashlight toward the nearest window, but the glass was frosted over. The view blurred like a half-remembered dream. The crunching moved, circling, each step deliberate, as though whoever it was wanted us to know they were there. Eli set the flashlight on the counter and reached for the rifle propped against the wall. His jaw was tight. "Back away from the window, Claire!" I did, heart pounding so hard it hurt. Every instinct told me to hide, but another part of me wanted to see, needed to see. The steps stopped, and then, just as quickly, they started again, fading into the storm. Eli didn't lower the rifle, not for a long time. Morning came slow, gray light seeping through the frost-laced windows. The heater had sputtered back to life sometime before dawn, but the cabin still felt chilled, as if the cold had settled into the wood itself. Eli was already up, boots on, rifle leaning against the doorframe. "I'm checking outside," he said without looking at me. I wrapped myself in the old plaid blanket and followed anyway. The air was sharp enough to sting, and the snow glittered under the thin light like broken glass. At first I didn't see it. Then my eyes caught the shape. Small, dark, half buried in the drift right at the bottom step. Eli knelt, brushed the snow away. It was a tin box, dented and cold to the touch. The kind you might keep keepsakes in, or letters you didn't want anyone to find. No note, no name. Just that box, sitting there like it had been waiting for us to wake up. Eli stood, the box in his hands, and for a heartbeat, his expression shifted. Something between recognition and dread. "You know what this is," I said. He didn't answer, just turned and walked back inside, snow falling from his boots onto the worn rug. The latch clicked open. I leaned forward, my breath catching. Inside, beneath a thin layer of yellowed paper, was a photograph of me from years ago. The edges of the photograph curled, the colors faded to the sepia of memory. I remembered the day it was taken, or rather, I remembered the feeling of it. Late summer, wind in my hair, a road that seemed to go on forever. But the question was, who had been there to take it? Eli set the tin box on the table, sat down slowly, and pressed both hands to his face. "Eli," I said, my voice thin, "what's going on?" When he looked at me, there was something raw in his eyes, like the storm outside had found its way into him. "I didn't meet you by accident," he said. The words landed heavy, like stones dropped into deep water. I stared. "What are you talking about?" He nodded toward the photo. 3 years ago, someone paid me to find you, said you'd left something behind that didn't belong to you. I tracked you for months, and then I stopped." "Stopped? Why?" "Because by the time I caught up to you, I didn't care about the job anymore. I cared about you." The wind rattled the cabin walls, but beneath it, I swore I heard that same faint crunching in the snow again. My pulse quickened. "Eli, if you stopped, then who's still looking for me?" He didn't answer. Instead, he stood, walked to the window, and pulled back the curtain just enough to peer out. The snow was untouched, except for one new trail of footprints. They led from the tree line straight to the steps and stopped. The wind howled so fiercely it swallowed the sound of my own breath. Snow swirled outside in frantic spirals, and for a moment I thought the footprints might be a trick of the storm. But then, 3 slow, deliberate knocks at the door. Eli's shoulders tensed. He glanced at me once, as if to say, "Stay behind me," and moved toward the door with measured steps. "Don't," I whispered, but the latch was already clicking open. A blast of cold and white roared inside, and in the doorway stood a man wrapped in a heavy brown coat, his scarf pulled high to shadow his face. Snow clung to his eyelashes, but when he spoke, his voice cut through the storm. "Claire Hale," he said, like a name he had practiced 100 times. I froze. Nobody had called me by my maiden name in years. Eli stepped between us. "She doesn't go by that anymore." The man's eyes flicked past him to me. "Doesn't matter. You have something of mine?" Before I could respond, his hand slipped into his coat pocket. For a fraction of a second I thought I saw the glint of metal, but he only drew out a small leather-bound book. He placed it on the table. When I glanced down at it, I saw my own handwriting on the cover. "Where did you get this?" I demanded. He didn't answer. He simply said, "You left before I could give you the rest of it, and now you need to hear what's inside." Eli's hand brushed mine under the table, a silent warning, because in that moment I wasn't sure if this man was here to return something or to take me back to a past I had tried to bury. The leather was cracked, edges worn soft from years of handling. When I touched it, my fingertips trembled, not from the cold, but from recognition. This was mine, written in another lifetime, when I still believed in certain futures and feared certain truths. I opened the first page, and the scent of old paper hit me, along with words I'd almost forgotten. If you're reading this, it means I couldn't tell you face to face. The truth is safer in ink than in my voice. I kept turning pages, names, dates, places Eli had never heard of. Some entries were smudged with water stains or maybe tears. Then, there it was, a name underlined 3 times, Eli's father's name. My heart clenched. The words below were brief, but they cracked something wide open in me. He doesn't know about the child. I never told him. I couldn't. The room felt smaller. Eli leaned over my shoulder, reading, his breath sharp in my ear. "Claire, what is this?" I closed the book, my voice barely a whisper. "It's the reason I left all those years ago." The stranger stood by the door, watching us like a man who just lit a fuse and was waiting for the explosion. And deep inside, I knew. When the last page was read, nothing between me and Eli would ever be the same again. The fire had burned low, casting long shadows that wavered across the cabin walls. The photograph, the tin box, the leather journal, they lay between us on the table, like evidence from a crime neither of us wanted to name. Eli sat across from me, elbows on his knees, hands clasped so tight his knuckles whitened. He hadn't spoken in nearly an hour. Outside, snow kept falling, muting the world beyond the window. The stranger was gone, at least for now, but his absence felt less like safety and more like a promise. "You should have told me," Eli said finally, his voice low, not angry. Worse than angry. "I wanted to," I whispered, "but wanting and doing aren't the same thing." His eyes lifted to mine, and I saw something break in them. Not trust. That had been splintered long ago. It was something quieter, something harder to name. From somewhere deep in the forest, a single, sharp crack echoed, like a tree splitting under its own weight, or a gunshot. Eli reached for the rifle. I closed the journal and slid it into my bag. The door creaked as he stepped outside, the cold rushing in to claim the air between us. I stood there a long moment, watching him disappear into the falling snow until the white swallowed him whole. And I thought, maybe the truth doesn't set you free, maybe it just changes what you're willing to survive.